Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends. Thank you for joining me on yet another episode of Pushing Beyond the Obvious. I'm your host, Mukesh Gupta, and welcome to the show again. As you know, we've been talking about becoming leaders worth following, building cultures worth belonging to. And one of the important things that we need to do as leaders is to continuously evolve our leadership, continuously evolve ourselves. And um, there are times when we feel that there is only so much that you can do by yourself. And at some point in time in your leadership journey and evolution, you need to, find external help, people who can actually help you, support you, and point out, where are the potential areas that you need to kind of, evolve into and things like that. And today we'll delve into that topic. And I'm super happy to host Dr. Richard Chambers. Richard, can I ask you to quickly introduce yourself, the body of work that you've done, and how you've reached where you are?
Absolutely. Great. Well, it's really happy to be here, first of all. And I help leaders and teams embed cultures of sustainable peak performance and conscious leadership. So part of my work is facilitation and consulting, and part of my work is coaching. And today, I guess we'll be talking a little bit more about my coaching. So by way of background, I'm a clinical psychologist, and for about 20 years, a little over 20 years, I've been teaching mindfulness. And in the beginning, I was teaching sort of generic mindfulness courses, but then over time, that started to niche down into working with business leaders, both entrepreneurs and leaders in really small, medium, and large businesses. These days, I tend to target medium to large businesses because I love seeing the kinds of transformation that I can create there. And so everything that I do has this kind of mindfulness base to it, but it's much more than that, of course. I bring in all of my clinical psychology skills, positive psychology skills, and of course, I stay up to date with all of the latest leadership research and frameworks. So I bring all of that together. And what I like to do is to target performance, well-being, and leadership simultaneously. And I find the sweet spot at the center of that Venn diagram, whether that's a thriving leader or a thriving team or a thriving organization. That's where I tend to focus my efforts. Because of course, leaders who are drowning in their work, or teams that are drowning and overwhelmed and unable to focus on the right thing at the right time, they of course underperform. So we need to lift that performance game. Leaders and people in general who are sort of, working hard but not taking care of their well-being, of course, they start to burn out. And they're at risk of all sorts of things as a result of that. And burnout, of course, being the opposite of engagement, that has a negative net impact on performance. So we want to work with performance and well-being at the same time. And then, of course, that leadership piece is so important, because if the leadership in an organization isn't on board with those first two, any intervention doesn't tend to stick. And of course, some leaders need help with their own performance and well-being before they're able to lead effectively. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot of my approach.
That's interesting. I think it is important for leaders to understand the fact that it is important to not only perform, but in order to perform consistently, you need to be able to take care of your mental health being, your physical health, and also your emotional health, and also your financial health. So I have this thing that I talk about, if you really want to build a powerful life, your best expression in terms of your life, you need to be able to work on your relational health, you need to work on your financial health, you need to be able to work on physical health, emotional health, intellectual health, and spiritual health.
Yes.
So these are the 6 things that you need to work on.
Last one too, it's often overlooked. Very important.
Yeah. So coming back to coaching itself, and for leaders to, number one, be high performing as individuals and as leaders themselves, but also to kind of build a culture which not only encourages but supports high performance. I personally feel that coaching is super important. Now, the first question that people ask me is, how do I identify a good coach, and whether or not a particular person is a good coach that I can work with? Is there any criteria? Is there that I need to look at? How do I identify the right coach to work with? So, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I would say accreditation and or track record are a pretty good place to start. I'll probably focus in a little bit more on the track record side of things. So, quite often people perhaps hear about a coach for the first time through word of mouth. Maybe a colleague or a friend or someone has worked with someone and produced and experienced some great results. So that's a pretty good place to start. Usually, when I'm looking for coaching myself, I'll often either find somebody through my network, through word of mouth, or sometimes I go off looking for a very specific skill set. And then sometimes it's about perhaps just trying people out and just making, just seeing. So, for instance, recently I've been very interested in a model of, you could call it personal development, called internal family systems, which I'll be talking about with you today. It's a core part of what I do in my own coaching work now. And I was trying to find a supervisor, somebody to supervise my coaching. And so I tried a couple of people. I went through about 2 or 3 people. And, you really have to perhaps sometimes just roll the dice a little bit, give it a bit of a go. But I think pretty quickly you get a sense of whether you feel comfortable with someone, whether they're adding value or not, whether it feels like a good fit. And it's funny, because if we go to a barber and get a haircut that we don't like, we probably will find a new barber. If we go to a mechanic and the car comes back and there's still problems and they've overcharged us, we'll probably go and find a new mechanic. However, with coaches, and I noticed the same thing when I was working as a clinical psychologist, people will often kind of stick around with a coach or a therapist for quite some time, even if they're not really sure what they're getting from the sessions, even if they're not quite sure if it's a good match or they're getting value from that, which I find very strange. Now, obviously, we do need to spend some time, because it's relational. We do need to spend time with people to get to know them a little bit before we can make judgments like that. But I think sometimes people spend too long. And so the kinds of things that I would be looking for would be obviously somebody who is able to understand our world, either because they've been in that world before or because they're able to, empathically listen and really understand. They're able to reflect that back in a useful way so that we can start to see things in new ways that we hadn't seen them before. I would personally always look for somebody who's practical, who gives me exercises and activities to do. So often I hear from my coaching clients when we talk about previous coaching work that they've done that I asked them what their goals were in their coaching. And sometimes people really struggle to articulate that, which always kind of makes me wonder, if we don't have a clear sense of what the outcome is, how do we know if a session is moving us in that direction or not? If we haven't broken that down into a series of manageable steps, again, how do we know that we're moving in the right direction? So these are all things that I would look for. And then, of course, it can sometimes just be an intuitive thing, right? Because if we feel comfortable with somebody, we're going to be more honest, more vulnerable, and then we're going to get more from the process than if we feel a little bit guarded or like we have to hold things back.
Interesting. So I'm familiar with the IFS system. Richard Schwartz, I think, if I'm not wrong, was the founder of the
Indeed,
IFS
that's
system.
correct. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's go there when the right time comes in. But I think before we move forward, I wanted to understand from you, what role do you think a coach plays when it comes to coaching a leader? Or what are some of the things that a coach, where and how does a coach bring value to a leader, let's say?
Yeah, look, from everything that I've studied and learned, and from my own experience, both being a coach and receiving coaching, one of the primary things that a coach brings is that opportunity for reflection and increased self-awareness. Because, a lot of the time, particularly successful people, we're so busy doing things, whether it's, working, leading teams, then being at home, being partners, being parents, engaging in hobbies and interests, seeing our friends. There's not a lot of time for self-reflection. And these days, unless we engineer it, there's almost zero downtime in people's days where they're sitting and just being and tolerating being bored and having that time for introspection and self-reflection. So that's one of the first things that coaches give us. And this is sometimes that's actually all my clients want. They just want a little bit of space in their calendar where they're reflecting on their own thinking processes and their own behaviors. And of course, once we start to reflect on them, we can start to spot patterns. We can start to get a bit of metacognition and distance from our thoughts and start to know what's working and what's not working. So sometimes that's kind of the lowest hanging fruit, really, the self-reflection.
Interesting. I remember something that I was reading earlier today. It's about being able to observe ourselves in real time as someone, a third party. And if we are able to do that, nothing like it. But if we are not able to do that at some point in time, it's always a good idea to bring someone who can actually do that for us or help us get
Indeed.
there.
Yeah,
In-
exactly. So that's one of the things. And of course, there are other things that coaches can bring that offer a lot of value. Another thing that's really useful is somebody who's able to listen and then paraphrase back to you what you're saying and help to clarify your own thinking. Because sometimes I notice when I let people talk, they start to hear themselves talk and notice themselves think, and they make their own connections and get their own kind of insights into what they're thinking and doing. Sometimes it's immensely helpful for me to be able to just feed that back, especially if I can condense something down. That's one of the things that I'm noticing I'm quite good at. When somebody tells me a lot of information, I can usually distill that down into the essence of what they're trying to say. And so people find that immensely useful as well. And then, of course, coaching is about outcomes. Good coaching, of course, is about outcomes. So we set those goals, we break it down into manageable steps, we set the SMART goals. And then, of course, it's about making, like, laying out that progression, making perhaps a big end game, a big goal, making it manageable, breaking that down so that it's a stepwise process. And any session with me, we'll have that larger goal, we'll chunk that down, we'll have a think about what are we doing in the next fortnight. My sessions are classically fortnightly, the cadence. So what are we going to be doing? What practical steps, SMART goals, whatever it is, are we going to be doing in that next fortnight block? So that's another obviously very useful thing, just to turn huge projects sometimes into manageable steps, a step-by-step process. And then, of course, one of two things happens. Clients either go off and take that particular step, do the homework task or the home play practice, do that, take that step, or they don't. And this is where I find that my clinical psychology expertise becomes really useful, because I'm sure some coaches just do this intuitively, but what I've noticed when I do coaching training and when I speak to other coaches is quite often they will be getting the clients to set goals, keeping them accountable. So if the client comes back, why haven't you taken that step? Obviously, there'll be some sense of what happened there, what got in the way. But I find personally digging into that and having a look at what are the obstacles and blockers that get in the way, that can be immensely useful for people. So the frame that I bring, if somebody comes back and hasn't taken that step, the frame that I bring is that we don't judge that, we don't evaluate it. It's not good, it's not bad, it just is what it is. And then we slow right down and start to explore, okay, what was going on there that was actually getting in the way? What are the blockers and the obstacles? Sometimes if the end goal is, step 100, and we've broken that down into 100 small steps and we've encouraged them to take the first step, sometimes even that first step turns out is actually step 10. And so we might need to break it down further. Sometimes they just hadn't spent long enough thinking about why they wanted to take this step. And so that intrinsic motivation isn't there. But quite often there's some fixed mindset, there's some emotional blocker, there's something going on under the surface that's prevented them from taking that step. And when we're able to create a space of non-judgment and introspection where we can reflect on what that is, that tends to unlock not only that next step in the coaching journey, but tends to unlock a lot of areas of their life, because the kinds of belief systems and the mindsets and the blockers that get in the way of doing something like, moving forward in a coaching journey are generally, as I'm sure you'd know, Mukesh, they're generally the kinds of things that block people in multiple areas of their life. And so sometimes that piece there can really unlock flow in a whole lot of areas, including things that are totally tangential to the coaching process.
Interesting. I was watching an interview of Usain Bolt yesterday, and one of the things that he said was that his coach told him apparently that in order for him to learn to win, he needs to learn to lose. And he said that it took him 2 years for him to figure out what his coach meant by that one single statement, and that once he was able to figure that out, his performance became so improved that he became the Usain Bolt that we all know, and the world champion that he was. And I think that tells a lot that what you said, the ability to unlock something in us in one sphere has an impact on every other sphere that we are engaged as well, because we are one full human being, right? So it's not just that we are a separate person at work and a separate person at home, but it's an integrated being. And so if you unlock something in one part, it does have an effect on everything else as well. So my next question to you is, when should someone actively go out looking for a coach? Is there an ideal time space when someone can actually benefit the most by seeking out a coach, or is that doesn't matter as to where they are in their journey? So maybe you can share your insights there.
Well, I'm going to say something that is going to sound a little bit self-serving, but I think everybody can benefit from coaching. Let's just be really honest. I mean, who isn't going to benefit from having somebody who can provide a space for self-reflection, mirror back what you're saying, help you to get clear on your goals, help you to break that down into manageable steps, help to keep you accountable, and help you to explore what's getting in the way if you're not moving forward. I mean, that's something that people at any level of functioning, any level of an organization are going to benefit from in some way, right? So that's kind of my first answer. So, and I personally, I've gone in and out of coaching my whole career, coaching therapy, of course, it's a sort of a related but separate thing, but I've just gone in and out my whole career because I personally value, I value growth. I value development. I value awakening. These are some of my core values. And so having an ally in that and investing money and time in that, which of course makes it real and makes it valuable, I find these things have been very, very powerful. So there's that answer. And then of course, are there key times in people's lives where they would really benefit from coaching? Yes. I think about some of my clients I'm working with at the moment. Some of them very high functioning people, but are starting to bump into health problems, whether it's physical or mental health problems. Because people tend to be, high performers are often, they're doing things in an unsustainable way that they can keep up for so long, but sooner or later, a physical health problem or a mental health problem or some form of relationship problem. They're the canaries in the coal mine, health and relationships. So sometimes those things aren't going super well. And that's when people might want to come for some coaching to look at, what's happening here? Why am I doing things in such an unsustainable way? Where does this drivenness come from? Why am I chasing that external validation? And of course, sometimes before bumping into those canaries in the coal mine, people aren't very motivated to explore that, because when things are going well, it doesn't matter if they're doing things in an unsustainable way. They might be leaving a trail of wreckage behind them, but they're not incentivized to confront that. So that's one of the times. Sometimes a lot of the leaders I work with are stepping up into another level of operations, going from middle management to senior leadership to C-suite, these kinds of changes. And so sometimes they're stepping up and feeling like imposters, like they're, that imposter syndrome, and worry that they're just not as smart as everybody else around them. And suddenly they're not sure why they're in that room, in that role. So helping them through that is really important. Sometimes they step up into a new role where there's an entirely new skill set. A classic progression is people are operational, they're on the tools, we call it in Australia. So they're on the tools, then they step up into a leadership role, expected to lead and manage teams and work with communication and conflict and all those things. And sometimes they're not given the tools that they need. So I will help them to integrate. I'm known for being very practical and evidence-based in the kinds of things that are giving people the practical tools and strategies. So I'll help them to build in all of those new tool sets to thrive in that role. And then, of course, at some point later, they might get elevated to a senior strategic leadership role where that's a different skill set again. So then we need to build that in. So these are some of the times. So it can be leadership progression. It can be, bumping into problems. Or it can sometimes just be, hitting a bit of a crisis point. Like I had a sales call yesterday with somebody, a new coaching client. I had a strategy call with them to, and they were saying, look, they've achieved a lot of those extrinsic goals, multiple businesses, expensive cars, great lifestyle, but starting to kind of sense that this maybe isn't actually what's going to make me happy long term. And I love those kinds of conversations because they're very alive, and people often feel kind of confused and lost, and they're seeing that like a really bad thing. But I see it as the beginning of something very healthy and profound. And so catching people at that point, something I really like. So that's another time, sort of reaching a crossroads. So getting to the top of a new ladder, hitting a crossroads, or hitting a dead end with health and relationship problems.
Interesting. So if I have to think about it in a slightly different way, either when there are some people who like to exercise by themselves, so just a little bit of pain every day, or regularly, or end up being forced to do so because of health reasons, or endure pain, so painkillers or exercises. So one of those two, when you're in pain or when you really want to be healthy and are willing to exercise. So both kind of benefit from exercising, and that's also the way I look at it from a coaching point of view. If you are struggling with something, please go talk to a coach or find a coach for yourself. And if you really want to find and build high performance, become high performing in whatever role that you are looking to be in, again, I think coaching can help.
Actually, I'll just pick up on that point, Mukesh, because there's one category that I forgot to mention, which is the category that I'm usually in, which is there's nothing wrong. I'm not missing necessarily any key skill sets, and I'm not bumping into any problems, but I just want to grow as a person. I want to become more capable as a human being, as a leader, as an entrepreneur. And so sometimes just having that coach is actually a very helpful thing just to continue that progression. I mean, people like you and I, I'm sure you have a meditation practice, self-reflection practice. I have good friends around me, I do all of the right things, but sometimes just having that ally there can also be a very useful thing, not to solve any problems, but just to continue that growth trajectory.
So logically, the next question then comes as, what can leaders do to prepare themselves to benefit from engaging a coach?
Yeah, that's a great question. The people that get the most out of their sessions with me are either people that in the category of they have an injury, they have to come and work through something, they've burned out, they've had a major problem with their team, their partner's threatening to leave them, they're incentivized in that way, and they often do the work that it takes because the cost of not doing that work is too high. So there's that. So sometimes, but if we think about what leaders need to do to prepare themselves, sometimes people just have realized that there's something that needs to shift inside. And the ones that get the best results with me are the ones that really prioritize the work. I can always tell if somebody has jumped into a Zoom call with me straight out of a meeting and then they're agitating to get to the next. I always tell my clients, I do hour-long sessions once a fortnight, and I tell them, minimum 15, ideally 30 minutes before and after to mentally prepare yourself for the session and to integrate it afterwards. And the ones that do that, the reason, obviously they get more out of the sessions because they turn up prepared and they integrate after. But if we step back from that, what is different about them is they're really valuing that. And sometimes my clients, they set aside that time in the calendar, they honor the commitment to turn up to those sessions at the same time every week, unless there's some kind of emergency. And then they apply everything that I teach them. And so if we think about how people could prepare themselves for that, they need to make it a priority. You need to set it as a priority. That's the first thing. So if it's just something that you're going to squeeze into your existing busy calendar, that's going to do some good, but you're not going to be getting the most out of that. So that'd be one thing that I would say. People who establish a meditation practice when I'm working with them, a mindfulness meditation practice, they also tend to progress much faster. And so one of the first things I'm doing with a lot of people is, it's not the only thing I do, but one of the core things early on is trying to get them to meditate. So if they were doing that beforehand, that would also be very useful. And then, of course, coming into that first session with a clear sense of what they need help with. Because sometimes it is that first session or two where we have to really drill down and get clear on, what exactly would you like to be different? What are the pain points? We sort of do like a SWOT analysis, really. So if someone's done that beforehand, they come in, they know what they want to do, they're ready to explain that to me, they're ready to get going. So these are some of the things that I found really useful. Yeah.
So in my conversations, people do reach out to me to coach them, though I don't do it professionally, but for family and friends. I've realized that a lot of times people do not know exactly what they want.
Yeah.
And that's where they need the most support on. And in my experience, as soon as that becomes clear, at least for that point in time, they are off to the races. They just needed that help, someone to actually sit down, listen, reflect back, and maybe help them clarify what they're good at, what they think they are good at, what other people's perception about them is, and where they need help, and what they want to avoid and what they need to kind of double down on. So that clarity, once they get, I think they're off to the races, at least for that point in time. But I totally agree.
People are often much clearer on what they don't want. Do you find that?
Yeah.
I even ask them sometimes, what do you want to get from this? And they start telling me what they don't want. It's like,
yeah, because I think we are conditioned that way. At least in the culture that I grew up in, we are conditioned to kind of accept whatever comes our way and not be greedy and not be too wanting in terms of what you want. I want this or I want that is considered to be greedy and not a good quality to have. So also kind of cultural upbringings play a role there as well. But at the same time, I think what you said makes a lot of sense, because as long as you come prepared, as long as you are willing to put in the effort that is required and that is expected by the coach, I think you will benefit a lot. I also feel that there are people who come to coaching sessions with with an open mind, rather than knowing that, okay, I want this and I want to achieve this, and are stuck there. Are some who probably don't get as much as someone who says, okay, here is what I think I want, but is open to kind of explore, and if there is something better than what they came in with, and are willing to change what they need based on the conversations, get a lot more from these conversations as well, than someone who's kind of adamant and stick to their guns in a way.
Of course. Yeah, I would agree 100%.
Yeah. So you mentioned Richard Schwarz and IFS. So how does that feature in your coaching sessions?
Well, IFS is premised on the idea that, not the idea, the reality, let's say, that we have parts or sub-personalities. There are different facets or parts to us. And people don't tend to reflect on that. When we talk about leadership, we often ask questions like, what is a good leader? What are the qualities that good leaders need to have? What are the values of effective leaders? We perpetuate what Richard Schwartz would call the monomyth, that we're one person. Now, of course, we are one person. I'm Richard, you're Mukesh. I mean, on one level, that's true. But on another very real level, we all know what it's like to have conversations going backwards and forwards in our head all day long. Like, I'm hungry. I want to have some lunch. I need to get this work done. I'm really tired. Maybe I should have a coffee. No, I really need to focus on this. Or, God, just, why, or we know what it's like to set New Year's resolutions, at the beginning of a year. So I'm going to get fit. I'm going to get healthy. I'm going to join a gym. We even sign up. We pay the money. And then for 3 weeks, we're going regularly. And then in the fourth week, of course, we're watching TV or snoozing our alarm. And we all know that experience, but we never really make the logical link that maybe actually there are different parts of us that want different things, have different values, different belief systems. And this is what internal family systems starts to unpack. So I often ask leaders when I'm working with them, what part of you is leading in any given moment? And once they start to notice that there are these different parts, they realize, hang on, some of these parts kind of take over and run the show. And all these parts of us, right? So let me name some of my parts that sometimes run the show that might resonate with some of your listeners. I've got a very strong achiever. There's a part of me that loves achieving, loves getting things done, feels good when I'm productive. And if I achieve things and get external validation, that feels really good. My achiever often tends to gang up with my perfectionist. What better way to achieve and get positive reinforcement and external validation than to do things perfectly? So sometimes I find myself obsessing over details, putting lots of pressure on myself, particularly if it's a new piece of work, a new piece of consulting, a new keynote, or working with a big client or something. I find myself feeling pressure. Now, a lot of people will just experience that pressure and just think that's the reality of this situation. It's unavoidable. I just have to get this. And they would believe the stories that I need to focus, I need to get this done. But I've learned that, hang on a sec, my achiever is running the show right now, ganging up with my perfectionist. And that tends to make me anxious, pull me out of my center. And I've noticed that even though the achiever part of me really wants good things for me, it wants me to succeed, it wants me to get recognition and, all the things that come with external validation and have success in my business. And they're all very noble things. It's just one part of me. And it tends to also bring with it a lot of costs, like stress and the risk of burnout. And, I'm just sort of not always happy when I'm in that part. And I feel tense and pressured, and my mind's a bit contracted. So my creativity and problem solving isn't perhaps as good as it would be if I was more relaxed. So that's one way. Some people have a very strong people pleaser. They have trouble saying no. They prioritize other people's needs over their own. And then they start feeling depleted, or they start feeling resentful. Depletion and resentment are the two kind of key indicators that a people pleaser might be running the show. Some people have a strong rescuer part. They see any kind of conflict or potential conflict between two people, and they will jump in and get into that victim triad of victimizer and victim and rescuer. So these parts of us often take over and cause problems. And I like IFS because it's so relevant to coaching, because we start to see, oh, okay, those behaviors that are causing problems for me, the conflict I'm having, the lack of focus, the burnout, the relationship issues, all these things, they're often just parts that are running the show. And once we can spot that, we can start to step out of it. We can perhaps understand a little bit about where that part has come from, why it thinks it needs to be, driving the bus in this particular moment. The moment we have some awareness of it, of course, we can step out of it to some degree and start to work with the situation a bit differently. But what I love most about IFS, it's funny, I discovered IFS probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And just before that, my what had evolved out of my psychological and therapy models into my coaching model, I'd started to put together my own model of coaching. And then I first discovered internal family systems. I'm like, oh, that's actually a very clear articulation of exactly how I was thinking. Often we're caught in coping strategies because some part of us is feeling vulnerable, some part of us is feeling uncertain, unsure of itself. So then we're sending an achiever or a perfectionist or a judge or a critic or a people pleaser or a rescuer or some other what are called protectors in IFS to protect us from that vulnerable feeling. And when that takes over and runs the show, that can, of course, we're either trying to control things or we're trying to avoid what's going on or numb ourselves from the discomfort. But the thing I would probably like the most about IFS is that when we recognize that we're not our parts, and step out of them, we come back to what IFS would call self with a capital S, sort of self-energy, being self-led. And so one of my primary objectives in my coaching work these days is to help, and in my facilitation too, I weave this in as much as I can when I'm working with teams, is to help people be self-led, not led by a part, but led by that calm, clear, compassionate, connected, curious, kind of true self that we have. I call it the inner CEO. Once we start to notice, oh, I've got a whole inner team here that are pulling in different directions and having conflict with one another, we come back to that inner CEO, and then we start to work with each of the parts to get them all on the same page, moving in the same direction. And what I've noticed with my clients is once I get them into that place with that self-awareness, that access to that self-energy, and then navigating and relating to their inner world in that way, all of them starts to move in the same direction. And they're much more connected with themselves, with their bodies, with their emotions, with their core intrinsic values. They're much more able to connect with other people. They're much more able to connect with just life in general. And so things tend to take on a greater sense of ease and flow. And so when with my clients that really get this, once they start to fully embody that self-led leadership, it just unlocks the most incredible things. I had a senior leader a while back who recognized that she was caught in a people pleaser part. She had this mindset that she had to be contactable pretty much around the clock for her team, that if someone needed something, she had to take that call, had to respond to that email, because that's what a good leader did. But I ran a workshop in her business around some major retailer business in Australia, and where I started to take them through this model, and it really resonated because she thought, "Oh my God, I'm run by that people pleaser, and if I'm not careful, I'm going to burn out because that's unsustainable to be." To be always on for the team, right? It's not sustainable, So as she started to see that, she realized, hang on, where's that coming from? And we did a little bit of exploration to see where those beliefs had formed in her life. And of course, a lot of these form kind of early on. That's our relationship with our primary caregivers that tends to shape that. Then we started to resolve that. So she started to see that this people pleaser wanted good things and got a lot of good things for her during her career, and was quite noble in its intentions, but also brought with it a lack of boundaries, a potential for burnout, and also was modeling, unhealthy behaviors. Let's be honest with her team, because her team would see that she was always responsive, so they felt like they had to be always responsive to one another, and it was creating this systemic problem. So as she started to recognize that, she became more self-led, and she realized, you know what, I care deeply about my team and I care about myself. So there's a limit. 8 p.m. at night, my phone's going on silent. I'm not checking emails because I know it's important to get a good night's, spend time with my husband, get a good night's sleep, come back in the morning, refreshed and happy. And she started to do that and felt better. Her team started to notice her new setting of boundaries and realize, oh, that's okay, is it? It sort of empowered them to do that. And really interestingly, her boss, she was worried about how that would be perceived because her whole career had been built in a large part on being a people pleaser. It was such a primary part of her psyche. and the way that she's shown up as a leader. She was quite worried early on, like, how's this going to land with my direct manager? Like, is that? And he loved it. He came to her and he said, thank you so much for being clearer with your boundaries, because now I really know where you're at. I never was sure if I could be asking you to do things at different times. It improved her personal brand. And during a time of pretty significant restructures in that company, she received a significant promotion as a result of that. So it really had a beautiful, positive impact on her team, her personal brand, and her career progression. So that's an example of coming out of a people pleaser.
Interesting. So the way I made sense of the entire IFS system was that the self that you're referring to, or the inner CEO that you're referring to, is in control, and a different is like a puppeteer, and in different scenarios you bring out a different self to lead based on what is required. So if you are in a situation which requires people pleasing, you bring out the people pleaser. If the situation requires you to be a perfectionist, you let the people pleaser back in the background, bring the perfectionist on. And if the situation requires some other self to kind of lead the way, you let the perfectionist go back into the background, and you bring whichever self needs to lead the way based on whatever the situation demands. And that way, not only, number one, are you in control of what's happening. You know that every single one of the selves that you have is there to support you and to kind of it wants the best for you. And at the same time, you're able to get the best out of each one of these selves that that make you the whole person that you are. And even before I kind of got to know about the IFS, I had written this book called Thrive, in which I talk about 9 different mindsets that one needs to kind of develop.
Book, right?
No, so this is my book.
Oh, you
I wrote a book.
Sorry. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So in which I talk about 9 mindsets that we need to kind of cultivate depending upon different situations that we kind of face in. So actor's mindset is one, philosopher's mindset is one, toddler's mindset is one, athlete's mindset is one, an entrepreneur's mindset, a scientist's mindset. So these are all different mindsets which bring different parts of your thinking, different approaches
different
to the situation. Yeah, different archetypes. And depending upon the situation, you kind of bring in the right archetypes so that you are able to deal with the situation the best way possible. And when I learned about the IFS, I kind of intuitively felt both of them kind of go hand in hand as well.
Interestingly,
so kind of
what you were describing a moment ago, I would say that's the halfway point in the journey, and this is where it gets really interesting. The beginning of an IFS journey is we're run by our parts and we have no awareness of that. We just know that something's not working. The halfway point is where we've stepped out and got enough self-energy in the room, enough of that inner CEO adult in the room, that we can, as you said really so beautifully, really lean into different parts and draw on the qualities that they have. There's nothing wrong with a perfectionist. I want to be able to lean into that at times if I need to get something done super duper well, and then lean back out of it. And that's the important bit, that we don't get stuck there.
Yeah.
But what I'm noticing, both in my own personal development work and of course, I guess by extension in my work with my clients, there's actually another step that we can take, which is to be fully self-led. So in IFS, the qualities of self, of the inner CEO, there are the 8 C's they talk about. So they are clarity, calm, courage, curiosity, compassion, connectedness, and 2 more that I can't think of off the top of my head, but you get the flavor of that, right? That's our true essence. When we're not caught in a part, we naturally show up in a way where we're fully present and connected with ourselves and what's going on in the moment. Where when we don't have a part, all paths show up as, fixed mindsets, agendas. They can have they sometimes show up as emotions, particular behaviors. This is kind of the way they show up. So when there's a part around, there's a contraction. Often there's tension in somewhere in the body, but there's also a mental, it can be quite subtle and it can be quite obvious, but there's a mental contraction, right? Like the self-critic, the judge is pretty obvious. There's a mental contraction. It feels tense. There's that kind of criticism going through the mind. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle, but because there's contraction, there's a limitation that's there. And of course, when we step out of that, we're able to be genuinely curious, genuinely compassionate, calm, connected. And once we start to show up in that way, what I've noticed, it unlocks a different way of functioning in the world, and it unlocks a different way of teams working together. If the leader in that team is embodying and emanating those qualities, it's almost like that's kind of radiating out. And as it hits other people, it just can evoke the same qualities in them. And so teams start to thrive. So here we're right on the edge of my own personal inquiry and what I'm doing with my most, with my best clients, let's say the ones that really get it. We're starting to explore, what would it mean to lead from that place? And it's actually somehow feels like it's beyond the parts. And yes, sometimes we can lean into the achiever and, take care of other people. And sometimes being, that's not a problem, but there's almost, do you know what I mean by that? There's almost something beyond. And I know that, the name of your podcast suggests that this is something that we could easily talk about here because, there's something beyond the ego. And beyond the ego leadership, servant leadership, there are different names for it, but there's something there that I think actually goes even beyond what we were describing a moment ago with using those parts.
I can talk about this for hours together because I am a big believer in the Hindu wisdom traditions, which talk about the Vedanta, the Upanishads, which talk about the self, which pervades every one of us. And I noticed that as well. Yeah. And it kind of fits in, right? So there is the self, which is kind of larger than all of us. And once we are able to realize and connect to that self, which is not easy, but the entire journey towards that is probably what makes it worthwhile. And
some would say it's not only not easy, it's maybe the hardest thing to do, but perhaps the most meaningful as well, to connect with what is beyond the ego.
Yeah, that's true. And that's all that the wisdom traditions ask you to do, which is to realize that you are not your body, you're not your physical self, you are the essence or the consciousness that exists. And the consciousness that exists within me is the same as the one that exists in you, that's the same as it exists in anyone else. And if we are able to tap into that, then that makes it that much more easier. And I do know about the 8Cs you're talking about. In fact, I remember I've written about it as well some time back. I don't remember the 8Cs as well, but I did. And once you're able to tap into that consciousness, then all those 8Cs kind of, become available for you to tap into in a way. So we are at 8 minutes to the time that we have allotted. Okay. So I'll come to some of the questions that I generally ask all the guests that I have on the show. First one is, do you have any resource? It could be a book, podcast, anything that you think has had significant impact on you and that you want all our listeners to kind of go and check out.
Sure. Well, I think I'll probably stay on the IFS theme for this one. So I've got some blog posts I can share with you if you like, and you can put them in the show notes. That's just a distillation of these ideas of parts and what it's like to work with parts, and a story of one of my clients who worked through his own achiever part that was burning him out and causing problems in his relationships. If people want to go a bit deeper into that, Rick Schwartz, the developer of internal family systems, he's written quite recently some very good books. There's No Bad Parts is his self-help book, which is a very concise and useful synopsis of the internal family systems model. And actually just yesterday, I started reading again another book that he'd written recently called You Are the One You've Been Searching For, I think is the name of that. And that's about IFS in relationships, how our parts interact with other people's parts, and how in any relationship, but particularly in our intimate relationships, we look for a partner who's going to hold the parts of us that are unresolved, and we outsource that, looking for the perfect partner that once and for all is going to help us feel calm and at peace in our being. And he says that, and it's so true, that that is just a fallacy and an unwinnable game. And so he instead promotes learning to hold all parts of ourselves in awareness, in self-compassion and mindfulness. And once we can do that, we feel a sense of inner ease and peace. And we can allow other people to hold us and care about us, but we don't need it. And if they are unable to do it or they withdraw at any given moment, we don't freak out. We're able to hold ourselves. And this, of course, can be with, intimate relationships. It can be with our boss giving us negative feedback. That can sometimes spiral us in the same way. So if we're able to hold on to those insecure parts of us that get triggered, then we're going to have a much easier life. So I'll share the blog post with you, and there are a couple of books we can put in the notes as well.
Super. So any quote which had a significant impact on you positively or negatively?
A quote. Yeah, man, there's been a few quotes in my time, hasn't there? Well, look, one of my first mentors, who was my mentor in mindfulness teaching, he's a Shakespeare fanatic. I mean, this guy's written plays on Shakespearean sort of, arguing that Shakespeare was a mindfulness meditator, right? But I really like the idea. There's that quote, nothing's either good nor bad. Thinking makes it so. And that is just something that I find so true, because events are just events, and one person reacts one way and someone else reacts a different way. And that says a lot about the nature of reality and how we shape reality through our own mindsets and reactions. And that, the first time I ever meditated in 1999, just by absolute chance, finding a meditation class back before mindfulness, back before anything, the first time I meditated and realized I'm not my thoughts, that was the beginning of a path of freedom, which of course might end up somewhere here one day, but along the way is a path of not getting caught up in neuroses and anxiety and fixed beliefs and stories and all that kind of stuff. So that quote, nothing's either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, really kind of speaks to that for me.
Nice. So last question, the show is called Pushing Beyond the Obvious. So what is so obvious to you, which people miss all the time, that makes you go, ah?
Look, there are a lot of things, and it's hard to pin that down to one thing, Mukesh, because I mean, this is the thing. Once we become quite skilled at something, what I assume is really basic is actually advanced for people. Sometimes when I'm working with leadership teams, I'm dropping in these non-dual practices, helping them to access self, and then even seeing if I can take that even further into that sort of, true wisdom tradition, self-inquiry. And some people kind of get where that pointer is going, but for a lot of the people in the room, that's kind of way beyond where they're at. And one of the things that's really been dropping in for me recently is that sometimes the most basic practices to me are a huge step for some people. And so I've been sort of obviously always having different conversations with different levels of awareness in the room. But I think if everybody did 5 to 10 minutes a day of meditation, I just think that would unlock so much. I mean, the research is super clear. That's going to help us to feel better, be less stressed, because we spend more time in the moment, less time worrying about things, right? But that other thing that I mentioned before, of just realizing I'm not my thoughts. So many people think that they're their thoughts. Coming back to your earlier question, what does coaching give us? Being able to recognize that's just a belief system. That's a pattern of thoughts that you are believing is reality. And somehow a regular meditation practice, you just kind of see the same thought patterns going through the mind, causing the same emotional reactions. And you start to realize, maybe I'm not those thoughts. Maybe they're things that are just happening in my mind right now. And there's something immensely freeing in that. And as I said, my clients who establish a meditation practice, they progress quicker. If they come into coaching with an existing meditation practice, even of just 10 minutes a day, they've got a huge head start. When I did my doctoral research, I found that depressed teenagers who had higher levels of trait mindfulness at the beginning of treatment, irrespective of whatever treatment they got, they had better outcomes at the end. So there's something about that as a practice that I always just promote to people. And I wish more people were not only knew about, but understood the value of it, that it goes way
I
beyond.
can
Yeah, sorry, you jump in.
no. So I said I cannot let you go without you telling us what do you mean by meditation, because there is just so many different things that are being spoken about as meditation. What is and what is not meditation? So I'll
Yeah.
need to double click on that and ask you to tell us what do you mean by meditation.
Right. Well, I can describe that pretty clearly. The term meditation, it just means attention training. I think that's the way to understand it. The term means attention training, which then begs the question, okay, if we're training our attention and learning to focus on something, what are we paying attention to? And that's when, of course, you open up this whole box of different types of meditation practices. So there are contemplative practices, there are visualizations. People imagine beaches and mountaintops and relaxing things. Uh, some people consider prayer a meditation. There are mantra meditations, repeating, a mantra, giving our attention to that thing. There's mindfulness meditation where we pay attention to what's happening in the present moment, which of course is happening through the body and the senses, feeling the feet on the floor, noticing breathing, noticing what we can hear and see and smell and taste. So there are these different categories, but what's common to all of them is giving our attention to something. And then, of course, we notice immediately that our attention doesn't want to stay there. It wants to wander off. Two famous Harvard researchers, Matthew Killingsworth, Daniel Gilbert, discovered that 46.9% of the time on average, our attention is not going to stay on this is a 2010 paper they published in Science, and I'm sure you know about, doesn't stay where it wants. So if the mind keeps wandering off, then we're going to have to learn to bring it back. And if it wanders off and we get frustrated with ourselves or judge ourselves or get annoyed, like that's more mind wandering and distraction. So that's wandered off and we bring it back. And of course, if we keep bringing our attention back over time, that the mind starts to calm down. We get some mental clarity, we get some physical relaxation going on. We become more connected with our bodies, more connected with people around us, and particularly when we practice mindfulness meditation. So that's really what I mean. And so you've got the meditation, which is often done, not always, but sitting in a chair, set a timer, put on a guided practice, breathe, whatever, train the attention to come back and back. And then we open the eyes. And then, of course, we want to bring that quality of awareness as much as we can into our day. And in the beginning, you can sort of separate out the sitting meditation and the rest of the day. But as a practice starts to unfold and mature, off the cushion out in our day, that can start to take on a quality of kind of being like a meditation. If we walk into a meeting or a negotiation or sit at our desk to do some emailing and we have some presence and we're noticing what we're doing, of course we're going to do that better. So that's how I would define meditation.
Interesting. So thank you so much. I think we're 2 minutes over the time that we had for this conversation. So can you let people know where they can find more information about yourself, about your practice?
Absolutely. If people Google drrichardchambers.com, drrichardchambers.com, that's the perfect place to learn more about me and what I offer, both through my coaching and my facilitation. I have my articles on there, my insights articles. I've got links to my books, to my 50 plus academic publications. So there's a wealth of free resources on that website, as well as ways to contact me and learn more about what I do. So I would send people there. And of course, Dr. Richard Chambers on LinkedIn as well. It's another good place to look.
Super. So thank you so much, Richard, for taking time and talking to me today. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it has. I've really enjoyed this. Thanks, Mukesh, for making time.
Uh, oops. So I think